They sold the frontier like a dream, but by winter it smelled more like old sweat, wet leather, and flower dust than glory. Elias Boone learned that before he turned 30, and he learned it with a length of rope in his hand, dragging painted backdrop boards behind the Red Flint Music Hall while a brass horn inside played songs about fearless cowboys who never went hungry. The boards were taller than he was, bright with full sunsets and clean horses and smiling men in fresh hats, the kind of pictures that made Eastern travelers clap before they even sat down. Elias had built half of them with his own hands. He knew where the paint ran thin. He knew which mountain was only canvas. He knew the hero on the poster had softer palms than a schoolteacher. But that was not what bothered him most. What bothered him was the smell of roasted meat drifting from the theater kitchen while his own stomach kept folding in on itself like a dry paper sack. He had been paid in promises for 11 days. Red Flint liked its stories polished. It liked its boots shined. It liked dead legends more than living men. By noon the wind had picked up and begun shoving dust along the street in low brown sheets. Elias crossed the alley with a crate of stage lanterns balanced against his chest, his shoulders aching, his shirt dark under the arms, his hat brim frayed white at the edges. When he reached the side door, Mr. Vale, the theater owner, stopped him with 2 fingers against the crate as if the whole burden were light enough to pause with a gesture. "Straighten your collar," Vale said. "Tourists are arriving." Elias did not answer. He had learned the cost of answering men like Vale. He set the crate down, tugged once at the limp collar of his faded shirt, and looked past him toward the front street where the coaches were rolling in. Ladies stepped down first, gloved and bright-eyed, followed by men with silver watch chains and city posture, all of them turning slowly to admire Red Flint as if they had reached the edge of history itself. They saw the false fronts, the polished saloon windows, the painted sign that promised authentic frontier exhibition nightly. They did not see the boy asleep behind the feed store because he had no supper. They did not see the widow watering beans with dishwater. They did not see the men who worked 3 jobs and still owed for their own blankets. "Smile if they look at you," Vale said. "You are part of the atmosphere." Elias finally looked at him then. Vale wore a black vest with pearl buttons and boots that had never known a cattle trail. His beard was trimmed close, his cuffs clean, his voice smooth with the confidence of a man who earned money from other people's hunger. "Atmosphere does not eat," Elias said. Vale's expression cooled by a degree. "No," he said. "But atmosphere can be replaced." He walked off before Elias could decide whether anger was worth the strength it cost to carry. By late afternoon the boardwalk was crowded. A performer in a spotless duster spun a revolver made for show and bowed to applause. Inside the hall, a woman sang about moonlit rides and brave men with iron hearts. Outside, Elias hauled buckets, swept dung, lifted trunks, and kept his eyes down. That was when he noticed her. She stood at the far end of the boardwalk near the shuttered mercantile, still as fenced stone, wrapped in a dark wool shawl with dust along the hem and sunlight touching one side of her face. Apache. Maybe 28. Maybe older in the eyes. She was not dressed for display the way the traveling shows like to dress native women, no beads made brighter for white applause, no forced smile, no costume pretending to be tradition. She looked like someone who had walked a long road and intended to keep walking. She watched the town with the patience of a person measuring a lie. Elias might have looked away, but at that same moment a tourist laughed and called for a photograph with a real cowboy. The performer from the stage stepped into view with his polished belt and theatrical swagger, and the crowd gathered around him at once. Someone behind them pointed at Elias, dusty and bent with labor, and said, "No, not that one. He looks too miserable." A burst of laughter followed. Small laughter. Easy laughter. The kind that never bruised the people who made it. Elias stood with a broom in one hand and a splintered bucket in the other, and for one hard second the whole street went thin. Around the edges. He felt the heat in his face before he felt the shame. He bent to the bucket, pretending to adjust the handle. When he straightened, the woman at the end of the boardwalk was still watching, but not with pity. That made it worse. Or maybe better. He had not decided yet. Evening lowered itself over red flint in copper light. Lamps came on one by one. Music leaked into the street. Dust clung to sweat and turned every cuff and seemed the color of old bread. Elias carried feed to the rented horses behind the hall and found only half a scoop left in the bin. Typical. The show animals would be brushed till they shone, then fed less than ranch mules. He poured what he could, laid a hand on the nearest horse's neck, and felt the animal's ribs under the hide. From the yard gate came a quiet voice. "They cheer for the costume," the woman said. "Not for the man." Elias turned. She stood in the opening now, the last light behind her, one hand resting on the weathered post. Up close he could see the dust on her boots, the sharpness in her cheekbones, the calm in her mouth. "And which are you here to judge?" he asked. "The costume," she said, "or the man?" For the first time all day, Elias almost smiled. Almost. Then the music from inside swelled louder, and from the front street came Mr. Vale's voice calling his name with the sharpness men use when they mean ownership. Elias looked past her toward the alley, toward the hall, toward one more night of carrying someone else's myth on his back. When he looked at her again, she had not moved. Neither had the wind. "Nita Greybird," she said. "I think this town is afraid of the truth." Elias picked up the empty feed scoop and felt how little it weighed. "Then it chose the right place to hide it," he said. He worked through the first half of the show with the numb obedience of a man who could not afford pride. Lamps hissed above the wings. Grease paint and hot dust turned the backstage air thick enough to chew. Elias Boone carried prop saddles from one side of the curtain to the other while the audience out front laughed on cue and gasped on cue and believed. On cue. Every sound had been bought in advance. Spurs rang against clean boards that had never seen a cattle drive. A painted moon rose on a pulley. A singer in a bright red dress leaned into the footlights and turned hardship into melody for people who would ride back to St. Louis and call the frontier romantic. Elias kept his eyes low and his hand steady, but Nita Greybird's word stayed with him like a thorn under the skin. "They cheer for the costume, not for the man." She had said it plain, without cruelty, and because of that it had lodged deeper. Near the back entrance Mr. Vale stood with two railroad men and a silver-haired tourist from Boston, smiling his smooth smile and pouring whiskey into little glasses. Elias passed close enough to hear the tourist say, "Marvelous place. So raw. So authentic." Vale placed one hand over his vest as if he had personally built the horizon. "We preserve the old truth here," he said. Elias nearly laughed, but hunger had drained even that from him. Instead he stepped into the alley for air, where the night was cooler and smelled of damp timber, horse sweat, and the faint bitterness of coal smoke. Nita was there again, not leaning, not waiting exactly, just standing by the rain barrel as though she had been part of the alley all along. "Do you always appear when a man is about to say something foolish?" Elias asked. "Only when he is tired enough to say something honest," she answered. He looked at her more carefully this time. Her shawl was coarse, practical wool. Under it she wore a plain dress darkened by road dust, and around one wrist was a narrow leather tie rubbed soft with age. No ornament. No display. Even in town she carried herself like open land. "You should not linger by the hall," he said. "Vale does not like people who remind paying customers that this country was full before he started charging admission." Nita's face did not change. "That is why I linger." Inside, the audience exploded into applause. Through the wall came the false thunder of boots and shouted lines about brave men taming empty land. Empty. The word seemed to float in the air between them like a bad smell. Elias rubbed a thumb along the splintered edge of the barrel. "They say empty often enough and people begin to think it is true. People who profit from forgetting usually do," she said. Then she glanced toward his hands. In the yellow spill of the side lantern, the cracks across his knuckles showed pale with dried dust. "You should wrap those." Elias turned them over once, as though seeing them for the first time. "I had cloth," he said. "Sold it for oats 3 days ago." Nita did not offer sympathy. Instead she reached into the fold of her shawl and pulled out a small square of clean muslin, no bigger than a handkerchief. "Take it," she said. He did not move. "I cannot pay for it." "That is why you should take it." For a moment he hesitated, and in that pause the whole town seemed to show itself the way truth sometimes flashes in a window before the light changes. Music inside. Laughter outside. Men like Vale selling memory to strangers while men like Elias wore themselves hollow to hold the stage up. Women like Nita walking through places that wanted her history as decoration but not her voice as fact. He took the cloth at last. It smelled faintly of cedar and clean air, nothing like the hall, and he hated how much that simple thing nearly undid him. "Thank you," he said, the words rough. "Do not thank me yet," she replied. "You still work for liars." Before he could answer, the back door flew open and a boy from the stage crew stuck his head into the alley. "Boone, Vale wants you in the East Wing. Quick!" The fake corral gate jammed. Elias tucked the muslin into his pocket and returned to the theater, but the night had shifted. He could feel it in the floorboards. In the East Wing, two performers were cursing at a painted gate meant to burst open in a scene where heroic riders charged through danger. Elias knelt, found the warped hinge, and braced one shoulder against the frame until it aligned again. The crowd roared when the gate finally crashed wide in perfect time. From the stage it looked like courage. From behind it felt like unpaid labor and a bruised shoulder. An hour later the show ended, and the audience spilled into the street glowing with amusement. Women fanned themselves. Men repeated favorite lines. One boy begged his father for a toy revolver. Near the entrance, the silver-haired tourist spotted Elias lifting trunks onto a wagon and called out, "There is our melancholy cowboy again." His companions laughed softly, politely, the way well-fed people do when they think they are being kind by making fun of a man only halfway. Elias kept lifting. Another trunk. Another crate. Another small humiliation. Then the tourist, perhaps warmed by whiskey and applause, said, "Tell me, friend, do you all really sleep under stars and sing by campfire every night?" Elias set the crate down harder than he intended. His back ached. His stomach felt lined with wire. And somewhere beyond the false fronts and lamp glow he could still see Nita standing in the alley like the only unpainted thing in town. So he answered. "No, sir," he said. "Some nights men sleep in mud beside their boots because they cannot afford a room. Some nights they skip supper so the horse gets fed. Some spend years chasing work that leaves them owing more than when they started. And some stand right here while other men sell their misery as entertainment." Silence landed fast. Not complete silence. A horse snorted. Glass clinked in the saloon. But the soft social laughter died at once. The tourist blinked as if Elias had spoken in a foreign tongue. Mr. Vale, crossing the boardwalk only 10 feet away, stopped so suddenly his polished heel scraped wood. For 1 second Elias almost wished he could pull the words back. Not because they were false. Because they were expensive. Vale approached with that terrible smile men wear when anger has already been counted and folded away for later use. "Mr. Boone is overtired," he told the visitors. The poor fellow mistakes backstage strain for broader reality. Then he turned just enough that only Elias could hear the next part. "Come to my office when the street clears." Elias did not answer. Beyond Vale's shoulder, at the far edge of the crowd, Nita watched without expression. But this time there was something else in her face, small and steady as a match in wind. Not pity. Recognition. And that was somehow more dangerous than either of them knew. Before dawn, Red Flint looked less like a town and more like a stage left standing after the audience had gone home. The boardwalk was grey with fine dust. Empty bottles leaned under the saloon steps. A torn handle flapped against a hitching post, still promising another grand performance by nightfall. Elias Boone had not slept much. Mr. Vale had kept him standing in the office until near midnight, not shouting, because shouting would have lowered him, but speaking in that calm merchant tone that made punishment sound like bookkeeping. He had docked Elias 2 weeks of wages for embarrassing the establishment, then reminded him that a man who owed for board, oats, lamp oil, and laundry could not afford opinions. By the time Elias walked out, his pay was gone on paper, though he had never held it in his hand. He spent the remaining dark hours in the loft above the livery, staring through the slats at a slice of cold sky and wondering how a man could feel both furious and too tired to move. When the first rooster sounded from somewhere beyond the freight yard, he climbed down, washed his face with water that tasted faintly of iron, and stepped into the morning with the same shirt, the same hat, and one less piece of himself. Red Flint woke slowly. A wagon rolled past with flour sacks. A woman swept last night from her doorstep. Somewhere a baby cried, then stopped. The rising sun found every flaw that lamplight had hidden. Paint peeling from false fronts. Loose boards. Cracked windows. Men carrying themselves like old fences. Elias headed for the rear yard of the music hall, expecting work because hunger does not wait for wounded pride. Instead he found his blanket roll, his tin cup, and his spare shirt dropped in the dirt beside the trough. The stable boy would not meet his eyes. "Mr. Vale says the loft is for employees," the boy muttered. "He says you are not one now." Elias looked at the little pile that amounted to all his comfort in the world. "Did he say where I should go?" The boy shifted, ashamed on another man's behalf. "No, sir." Elias bent, shook dust from the blanket, and tied the roll with slow hands. He could feel the eyes of the yard on him. 2 handlers pretending not to stare. A seamstress crossing with a basket, pausing only a second. A cook at the back door who looked as though she wanted to slip him bread but feared being seen. That was Red Flint. Plenty of hearts. Very few spines. He slung the blanket over one shoulder and stepped back into the street. By full morning the town had become itself again, half labor, half performance. A fresh coach arrived from the east. The sheriff tipped his hat to people with money and ignored those without. The smell of coffee drifted from the hotel kitchen in thin, painful lines. Elias had 37 cents in his pocket and nowhere to stretch a night. He considered the freight depot, the church shed, the space behind the cooper's shop. All of them already spoken for in one way or another by other men living 1 hard inch from the ground. When he passed the mercantile, he saw Nita Greybird sitting on the edge of the dry fountain basin in the square, a canvas bundle beside her, as if she had expected the morning to unfold exactly this way. She looked up once. "You lasted longer than I thought." Elias stopped, too worn out for offense. "You predicted this." "I have seen men like Vale before," she said. "They never fear lies failing. They fear truth being spoken by the wrong mouth." He laughed once under his breath. "Then my mouth has become very expensive." Nita rose and lifted her bundle. "Come with me." Elias did not. "I do not know you." "That is wise," she said. "But wisdom is sometimes only fear with better manners." He studied her face, waiting for mockery and finding none. The square around them filled with ordinary sounds. Harness jingling. A clerk calling prices. The far-off whistle of a train. Then from the hotel porch came the voices of 2 women discussing last night's show. One said she adored the rugged realism. The other said the tired stagehand had spoken out of turn but had such a convincing face for suffering. Elias shut his eyes for a beat. When he opened them, Nita had already started walking toward the south end of town. He followed because standing still had become another kind of humiliation. They left the main street and crossed behind the tannery where the smell of lion hides gave way to dry weeds and sun-warmed stone. Beyond the last sheds lay a shallow wash and, past it, a line of low cartonwoods marking an old community well. Once it had served teamsters and laundry women and families too poor for private cisterns. Now the windmill beside it stood crooked and still. A dozen people lingered in the shade nearby with pails, jars, and tired patients. A Mexican mother with 2 children. An old black teamster mending a harness strap. A white widow Elias recognized from the edge of town. Not one of them looked surprised to see him. That told him more than any speech could have. Nita set down her bundle near the stone ring of the well. "This is where the town keeps its truth," she said. Elias looked into the shaft. At the bottom, far below, a skin of water caught the light like a coin no one could reach. "It is nearly dry." "No," Nita said. "It is kept nearly dry." He turned to her. She pointed with her chin toward the ridge above town where the new holding tank glinted faintly in the sun, part of Vale's expansion with the hotel owner and a cattle syndicate from the rail line. Elias had heard of the tank. He had also heard the pipes to the public well would be improved after summer. They had not been. "They divert more than they admit," Nita said. "The hall, the hotel, the rented bathrooms, the private stables for tourists. Water uphill for comfort. Mud downhill for everyone else." A child beside the well tipped a jar and waited for the slow drip from a hand pump that coughed more air than water. Elias felt something inside him go still. Last night had been humiliation. This was structure. This was design. Nita untied her canvas bundle and drew out a thin ledger wrapped in oilcloth, its corners worn, its pages swollen from old handling. She did not open it yet. She simply let him see it. "There are names in here," she said. "Debts. Water charges. Room deductions. Supply markups. People paying twice to stay thirsty." Elias stared at the book as if it might burn through the cloth. "Where did you get that?" "From a man who died owing more than he ever borrowed," she said. "He thought someone should keep the numbers honest after he was gone." The wind lifted dust across the wash. Behind them, red flint shone in daylight, respectable and false. Elias could hear a piano being tested in the music hall though they were half a town away. He looked from the ledger to the almost empty well, to the women waiting in line, to the old teamster stitching leather with fingers bent from years. Then he looked back at Nita. "Why show me?" Her answer came quiet. "Because they already made you visible. Now you must decide whether that was punishment or invitation." He did not reach for the ledger right away, and that hesitation stretched longer than pride usually allows, because something in him understood that once a man touched the truth, he no longer had the right to pretend he had not seen it. The wind moved slow across the wash, carrying the dry scent of cracked earth and old rope, and somewhere behind them a woman coughed into her sleeve as she waited her turn at a well that gave less each hour. Elias Boone looked down into that thin circle of water and saw not his reflection, but the outline of every day that had led him there, the long unpaid mornings, the staged nights, the careful humiliations dressed up as opportunity, and for the first time the pieces did not feel scattered, they felt arranged. "If I take that," he said quietly, "I do not get to stay invisible." Nita Greybird nodded once, not as encouragement, not as warning, simply as fact. "You were not invisible yesterday," she said. "You were convenient." He almost smiled at that, but it did not hold. He reached out then and took the ledger, feeling its weight, lighter than it should have been for something that carried so much of other people's lives. The oilcloth was worn smooth where hands had held it too often, and when he loosened the wrap just enough to see the edge of the first page, he caught the tight lines of numbers written with care, names pressed into paper as if they might otherwise be erased. He closed it again quickly, like a man who had opened a door he could not yet step through. Around them the small gathering by the well shifted, people measuring him without turning their heads. They knew what that book meant even if they had never seen it. They knew what happened to men who spoke from pages like that. "What do you want me to do with it?" Elias asked. Nita lifted her gaze toward the ridge where the holding tank sat bright and full in the sun. "I want you to decide if your voice belongs to them or to yourself," she said. He followed her gaze, then looked back toward town where the false front stood straight and clean from a distance, where music would start again before noon, where men would clap for stories built on the same numbers that were now in his hand. "And if I choose wrong," he said. "You will not," she answered, and for the first time there was something like certainty in her tone, not because she trusted him, but because she trusted what truth does when it is spoken in the open air. They stood there another moment, then Elias tucked the ledger under his arm, wrapped again in oilcloth, and turned back toward Red Flint with a walk that was not faster, not stronger, but somehow more deliberate, as if each step had begun to belong to him again. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the color out of everything, and the street had filled with the usual rhythm of trade and pretense, a wagon unloading crates of stage props, a boy chalking fresh promises onto a signboard, a pair of travelers asking directions to the evening show as if it were the only thing worth finding. Elias passed them without a word and moved toward the music hall, because that was where the lie was loudest, and he understood now that truth needed an audience too. Inside, the hall smelled the same as always, hot canvas, lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of sawdust spread to hide stains that no one spoke about. Mr. Vale stood near the stage, speaking to a man in a fine coat who looked like he had never lifted anything heavier than a glass. When Elias stepped in, Vale saw him at once, and for a brief second something like surprise crossed his face before it settled back into control. "I thought we had finished our arrangement," Vale said, his voice even, carrying just enough to let others hear authority without hearing conflict. Elias set his blanket roll against the wall, slow, careful, as if placing down the last piece of something he would not pick up again. "You finished yours," he said. "I have something else to say." The man in the fine coat glanced between them, curious now. Sensing that whatever this was might be more interesting than the show he had paid for. A few crew members paused in their work. A seamstress stopped threading a needle. Small shifts, barely noticeable, but enough. Elias felt the ledger against his side, felt the shape of it through the cloth, and understood that this was the moment Nita had meant, not grand, not loud, just a narrow opening where a man either stepped forward or stepped back and lived with that choice for the rest of his days. Vale smiled thinly. "If this is about last night, I would advise you to keep your thoughts brief." Elias shook his head once. "It is not about last night," he said. "It is about every night you sell and every morning you charge for." The room did not change all at once, but something in it tightened, like a rope pulled one notch closer. Vale's eyes flicked to the men nearby, measuring how much of this they would allow before it became inconvenient. "Be careful," he said softly. "Men who do not understand accounts often mistake them for injustice." Elias let that sit for a breath, then reached into the fold of his coat and drew out the ledger, not opening it yet, just holding it where it could be seen, where its presence alone began to disturb the easy order of the room. "Then help me understand," he said. "Help all of us understand." From the doorway at the back, unnoticed by most, Nita had entered and stood in shadow, her gaze steady, not on Vale, not on the crowd, but on Elias, as if the rest of the town had already become background to a decision that could not be undone. Outside, a gust of wind pushed dust against the windows, dimming the light for a second, and in that brief dullness the bright surfaces of red flint seemed to lose their shine, just enough for the truth underneath to show through the cracks. Elias did not open the ledger that moment, and that restraint unsettled the room more than any accusation could have, because silence carries its own kind of weight when it is held on purpose. Mr. Vale took one step closer, his polished boot tapping once against the board as if to remind the floor who owned it, and lowered his voice so that it reached only as far as it needed to. "Put that away," he said. "You do not know what you are doing." Elias met his gaze without raising his own voice. "That is not what I was told this morning," he replied. "This morning I was told I owe for a bed I no longer have and food I did not eat." A murmur moved through the small cluster of workers, not loud, not yet dangerous, but present, like a low wind beginning to gather. The man in the fine coat shifted his stance, curiosity sharpening into interest. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, the kind of question that expects a tidy answer. Vale turned toward him at once, the smooth host returning in a blink. "No problem at all," he said. "A misunderstanding between employer and employee." Elias spoke before the explanation could settle. "Not a misunderstanding," he said. "A pattern." That word landed differently. It did not accuse. It suggested something that could be counted, repeated, proven. Vale's smile thinned again. "You are tired," he said. "You are hungry. That makes men imagine structure where there is none." Elias felt the hunger, felt it twist under his ribs, but he also felt the ledger in his hand, and the quiet line of people by the well, and the way Nita had not asked him to be brave, only to be honest. He unwrapped the oilcloth slowly, each fold deliberate, the room watching now whether it wanted to or not. The pages showed at last, edges worn, ink steady, names written in full, not shortened, not hidden. He ran a thumb along the margin, not reading yet, just touching the record of something that had existed long before he stepped into it. If there is no structure, he said, then these numbers will not line up. Vale's eyes flicked to the book, then back to Elias, and for the first time a flicker of calculation showed, quick and sharp. Those are private accounts, he said. Stolen, if I am not mistaken. Elias did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He simply turned one page, then another, letting the faint sound of paper carry across the boards. Names, he said quietly. Charges for water from a public well. Fees for rooms that men built themselves. Deductions for tools that never left your store. The seamstress lowered her gaze. The stable boy took a step back. The cook at the door stopped pretending to wipe her hands. Small things. Small shifts. But they added up. Vale raised his chin. Even if that were true, he said, it is the cost of doing business in a hard land. Elias looked up then, and there was no anger in his face now, only a steadiness that came from seeing something clearly for the first time. Then why do only some men pay it? He asked. That question did not need volume. It needed space, and the room gave it. The man in the fine coat cleared his throat. I would like to see those accounts, he said, polite but firm, the voice of someone used to being accommodated. Vale turned to him, the host again, but the edges had begun to show. I assure you, he said, everything here is proper. Then it will be easy to show, the man replied. Another small shift. Another inch. Elias felt it, the way a crowd can tilt without moving, the way certainty can loosen when it is asked to stand under light. He did not press. He did not raise his voice. He simply held the ledger where it could be seen and waited, and in that waiting the room began to rearrange itself, not by force, not by fear, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of something that had been hidden too long to remain comfortable in the dark. The room did not break, and that was the strangest part, because Elias Boone had always believed that truth would arrive like a storm, loud and tearing, but instead it settled in like dust, quiet and unavoidable, touching everything at once. No one reached for him. No one shouted him down. The ledger remained in his hands, open now to a page where the ink had pressed harder, as if the man who wrote it had known he might not be believed and wanted the numbers to carry weight even after he was gone. Mr. Vale did not step closer again. He did not retreat either. He simply stood there, measuring the distance between control and exposure, and for the first time that distance looked uncertain. You are making a mistake, Vale said, but the words had lost their smooth edge, worn thin by the way they no longer moved the room. Elias did not argue. He turned the ledger so the man in the fine coat could see more clearly, and that small gesture shifted the center of attention without force, without demand. The visitor leaned in, not out of sympathy, but out of habit, a man accustomed to reading figures before trusting faces. His gloved finger hovered above a column. These are repeated charges, he said. Water access. Twice weekly. For the same names. He glanced up. And these men are employees of your establishment. Vale's reply came slower now. Standard provisions, he said. Shared resources require maintenance. Elias spoke, not louder, just enough to fill the space that explanation left behind. Then why are they charged again for lodging that includes water, he asked. The question landed clean. No accusation. No raised tone. Just a gap where the answer should have been. Around them, more people had gathered without stepping forward, drawn by the shape of something changing. The seamstress had moved closer, her needle forgotten in her hand. The stable boy stood near the door, not leaving, not entering, caught between habit and something new. The cook had come fully into the room now, wiping her hands on her apron without realizing she had already done so. Small witnesses. Quiet ones. But enough. Vale's gaze flicked across them, Counting, recalculating. You think numbers tell the whole story, he said, turning back to Elias. They do not account for risk. For investment. For the cost of building a town from nothing. Elias closed the ledger gently, not in defeat, but in completion, as if the pages had already said what they needed to say. There was something here before it was yours to build, he said. The words were simple. They did not accuse directly. But they carried the weight of everything Nita had not needed to say out loud. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man in the fine coat straightened and removed his gloves, one finger at a time, as if preparing to handle something more delicate than money. I would like copies of these accounts, he said. For my partners. It was a small statement. Polite. Reasonable. But in a town like Red Flint, it was enough to shift the ground. Vale inclined his head, but the motion was tight, controlled. Of course, he said. We have nothing to hide. Elias almost believed him for a second, because the lie was still dressed well, still carried the posture of truth. But then he saw it, the slight delay, the calculation behind the eyes, the way Vale's fingers pressed once against his vest as if checking for something that was no longer certain. That was when Elias understood the difference between power and control. Power could be held. Control could only be maintained as long as no one looked too closely. And now people were looking. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing dust against the windows in thin, restless sheets, dimming the sunlight just enough to soften the edges of everything inside. The bright paint of the stage props looked duller. The polished boots less certain. Even the air seemed to settle heavier, as if waiting. Elias stepped back then, not retreating, simply removing himself from the center he had never wanted in the first place. He set the ledger down on a nearby table, within reach of anyone who chose to take it, and in that act he let go of ownership, because truth did not belong to him. It never had. It had only passed through his hands. Nita Greybird remained in the shadow near the doorway, her posture unchanged, but her eyes followed the movement, not the ledger, not Vale, but Elias, as if measuring what kind of man he had become in the space of a single morning. He did not look back at her. He did not need to. The room had already answered the question she had asked at the well. Whether his voice belonged to them or to himself. The answer was standing in plain sight. A chair scraped lightly as someone shifted closer to the table. Then another. Not a rush. Not a crowd. Just a few people stepping into a space that had been closed before. The seamstress set her needle down. The cook moved to stand beside her. The stable boy took one uncertain step forward, then another. No one spoke. They did not need to. The ledger lay open again now, turned by hands that had once avoided it, and the names inside were no longer hidden in private columns. They were being seen. Vale watched it happen, his expression composed, but the stillness in him had changed. It was no longer the stillness of control. It was the stillness of a man realizing that something he had arranged carefully over time was beginning to move without his permission. We will address any discrepancies, he said finally, the words offered to the room, to the visitor, to anyone who needed to hear them. It sounded reasonable. It sounded measured. It sounded like the kind of statement that could restore order. But no one returned to their work right away. No one laughed. No one clapped. The music that usually filled the hall before noon had not started. Even the piano sat silent, its lid closed, as if it too had decided to wait. Elias picked up his blanket roll again, feeling its familiar weight against his shoulder, lighter now than it had been that morning. He turned toward the door, not hurried, not slow, just steady. As he passed Nita, she spoke without looking at him. You did not raise your voice, she said. You did not need to, he answered. Outside, Red Flint continued as it always had, wagons moving, signs creaking, dust lifting and settling, but something underneath it had shifted, not broken, not yet, but loosened, like a knot that had been pulled just enough to make its undoing possible. Elias stepped down from the boardwalk into the street, the sun warm on his face, the air dry in his lungs, and for the first time since he had arrived in that town, the weight he carried did not feel like something placed on him by other men. It felt like something he had chosen to set down. By the time the afternoon light stretched long across the street, the story had already begun to travel, not in loud declarations, not in official statements, but in the quiet way truth moves from one person to another when it no longer needs permission. Elias did not stay to watch it unfold. He walked past the saloon, past the mercantile, past the painted promises that had once seemed fixed, and each step carried him further from the version of himself that had accepted them without question. Behind him, inside the hall, voices would rise and fall, papers would be examined, explanations offered, perhaps even adjustments made. But those were not his to carry anymore. His part had been smaller than he once imagined, and larger than he had ever intended. At the edge of town, near the dry wash, he found Nita again. Standing where the land opened wide and the town shrank behind it, its edges softened by distance and dust. She did not ask what had happened inside. She did not need to. It will not change everything, she said. Elias nodded. No, he said. But it changed something. That was enough. Not victory. Not justice in the way stories like to paint it, clean and final. Just a shift. A beginning. The kind that does not announce itself, but leaves a mark that cannot be easily erased. The wind moved across the open ground, carrying the smell of dry grass and sun-warmed earth, and for a moment the world felt larger than red flint, larger than veil, larger than any ledger or stage or lie. Elias adjusted the roll on his shoulder and looked out toward the line where land met sky, not searching for anything, just seeing it as it was. Where will you go? Nita asked. He considered that, then shook his head slightly. Somewhere that does not need me to pretend, he said. She gave a small nod, as if that answer fit the shape of the road ahead. They stood there a while longer, not speaking, not needing to fill the silence, because the kind of quiet that followed truth was different from the kind that came before it. It did not press. It did not hide. It simply remained, steady and open, like the land itself. And in that quiet, without fanfare, without applause, something like dignity returned to a man who had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand with it. The road did not welcome him, and that was how Elias Boone knew it was honest, because it offered nothing it could not keep, only distance and the sound of his own steps settling into rhythm with the land. The sun leaned west, stretching shadows thin across the dry wash, and red flint behind him became less a place and more a memory made of boards, dust, and borrowed light. He walked without urgency, not chasing a destination, only moving away from something that had already let go of him. The blanket roll on his shoulder rubbed against his back with each step, a small, steady reminder of weight that was his and no one else's. Ahead, the ground opened into low grass and scattered stone, the kind of country that did not promise comfort but did not pretend to either. Nita Greybird walked beside him for a time without speaking, her pace even, her gaze set somewhere beyond the horizon as if she had learned long ago that answers did not live in the first mile. After a while she stopped near a bent cottonwood, its branches half bare, its trunk marked by years of wind and drought, and she rested one hand against the bark as if greeting an old acquaintance. Elias paused a few steps ahead, then turned back. "You are not coming further," he said. It was not a question. She shook her head once. "My road bends here," she replied. He looked at her, at the quiet certainty in her posture, and felt a strange kind of gratitude that did not need to be spoken to exist. "You could have kept that ledger," he said. "You did not need me." She considered that, then gave the smallest hint of a smile, not warm, not cold, just real. "Some truths need a witness who stands in the center of the lie," she said. "I do not stand there." He understood. Or at least he understood enough. The wind moved through the grass in a low whisper, carrying the dry scent of earth and distance, and for a moment the world felt stripped down to what it had always been before men built stages and called them truth. Elias shifted the blanket on his shoulder and nodded once. "Then I will carry it as far as it goes," he said. Nita did not answer. She only watched him for a second longer, then turned and walked back toward the town without looking over her shoulder, her figure growing smaller against the pale line of buildings until she became part of it again, another presence that did not belong to the story Red Flint told about itself. Elias faced forward and continued on, each step settling deeper into something that felt less like escape and more like alignment. By the time the light began to fade, he reached a stretch of land where the grass grew a little thicker and the ground held the faint memory of water. There was an old fence line there, posts leaning, wire slack, marking what had once been claimed and then abandoned, and beyond it a small shack stood with one wall bowed outward and a roof patched with mismatched boards. It was not much, but it was something that did not pretend to be more than it was. Elias crossed the fence, pushed open the loose door, and stepped inside. The air smelled of dry wood and long absence. A broken chair lay in one corner. A rusted bucket in another. The floor held dust undisturbed by footsteps for some time. He set his blanket down, looked around once, and for the first time in days, maybe longer, he felt no one watching him, no expectation pressing against his back, no voice telling him what he was worth in coin or silence. Just space. Just quiet. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and let the day settle out of his bones, slow and steady, like silt in still water. Outside, the sky turned from gold to grey, and the first stars began to show, faint at first, then clearer as the light drained away. He did not light a lamp. He did not need one. The dark did not feel like something to push back. It felt like something to rest inside. And in that stillness, without an audience, without a stage, without a ledger in his hands, Elias Boone understood that the story he had stepped out of would continue without him, reshaped, resisted, perhaps even denied, but no longer untouched. And that was enough. Back in Red Flint, the change did not arrive as a single moment, and that made it harder to dismiss, because no one could point to it and say exactly when it began. It showed itself in small things first, the kind people notice without naming. The seamstress did not return to her machine right away. She stood by the table where the ledger had been, her fingers resting on the edge as if feeling for something that had shifted beneath the surface. The cook spoke less loudly in the kitchen that afternoon, not out of fear, but because her thoughts had moved elsewhere, turning over numbers she had never been meant to see. The stable boy paused before handing over feed, glancing once at the tally board as if the marks there might not mean what he had always been told they meant. Even the piano, when it finally began to play again, sounded different, the notes a fraction slower, as if the hands that pressed them were listening for something between the beats. Mr. Vale moved through it all with the same composed manner, the same measured steps, the same voice that had guided the town's image for years. But there was a carefulness now, a slight hesitation before each assurance, a glance held a moment longer than before. He provided the requested copies of accounts, clean and ordered, numbers aligned, explanations attached, everything as it should be, and yet the original ledger remained in memory, in the way people now compared what they saw to what they had felt when the pages first opened. The man in the fine coat stayed longer than he had planned, asking questions that sounded polite but carried weight, questions about supply chains, about water rights, about deductions and agreements, and each answer Vale gave had to travel further than it used to, reaching not just the visitor, but the room, the workers, the quiet witnesses who had begun to look without being told where to direct their eyes. Outside, the town continued its routines, wagons arriving, signs creaking, dust lifting and settling in the same familiar patterns, but the conversations changed, low and brief, shared in doorways and along the edges of work, not loud enough to be called dissent, but steady enough to be remembered. A widow at the edge of town asked about her charges and did not accept the first answer given. A teamster counted his deductions twice. A young man refused to laugh when a performer exaggerated hardship for applause. None of it was dramatic. None of it would make a story worth selling. But it accumulated. It settled. It remained. And in the space where certainty had once stood without question, there was now a thin, persistent line of doubt, not enough to break the town, not enough to bring it to its knees, but enough to change the way it held itself. Late that evening, as the lamps were lit and the hall prepared once more to present its polished version of the frontier, Nita Greybird stood again at the far end of the boardwalk, watching without stepping forward, her presence as quiet and steady as before. She did not look toward the stage. She looked at the people, at the way they moved, the way they paused, the way they listened a little longer before agreeing. And after a while, she turned away and walked into the dark beyond the last building, leaving the town to its slow, inevitable work of remembering. The nights out there did not come with music, and that was the first thing Elias Boone noticed as the days settled into something like a pattern, because silence without performance had a different weight, one that did not press against him but asked him to listen instead. The shack held the day's warmth for a while, then let it go slowly as the air cooled, and he would lie on his back with his hat tipped over his eyes, hearing the small sounds that belonged to no one, the wind slipping through grass, the faint creak of the old boards, the distant call of something moving far beyond sight. There was no applause, no laughter, no measured voice telling him what mattered. Only time, passing without being shaped. He found work where he could, mending a fence line half a mile east for a rancher who did not ask many questions, hauling water from a deeper well another mile out, stacking wood for a widow who paid him in bread that tasted honest, rough and warm. The work did not promise more than it gave, and that was enough. Some mornings he would wake before the sun and sit on the low step outside the shack, watching the light come slow across the land, turning dust into color for a few minutes before it settled back into brown. It reminded him of the stage, but without the lie. One afternoon, a rider came along the distant line of the road, small at first, then clearer, the outline steady, unhurried. Elias watched without moving, because out here a man learned to let things arrive on their own time. As the rider drew closer, he saw the familiar shape of a dark shawl, the way it moved with the wind, the way the figure beneath it carried no need to impress the land. Nita Greybird did not call out when she reached the fence. She dismounted in one smooth motion and tied her horse to a leaning post as if she had done it before, though she had not. "You chose a place that does not listen to applause," she said. Elias almost smiled at that. "It listens to work," he replied. She looked at the shack, at the patched roof, at the line of wood stacked beside it, at the small signs of a life built without an audience. "That is harder," she said. He nodded once. "It is quieter." They stood there for a moment, the space between them filled with the same kind of silence that had first brought them into the same story, but it had changed now, less tense, less sharp, like a blade that had already done its work and been set aside. "Red flint still stands," she said after a while. "I did not expect it to fall," Elias answered. "It was not built to fall quickly." She studied him, then asked the question that had been waiting between them. "Do you regret it?" He considered that, looking out over the stretch of land that did not promise him anything beyond the next day's labor, and for a moment he felt the memory of the hall, the light, the structure, the illusion of stability that had once seemed necessary. Then he felt the absence of it, the space where that pressure used to sit, and he understood the difference. "No," he said. "I regret how long it took me to see it." Nita gave a small nod, as if that answer matched something she had already known. She reached into her little bag then and drew out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, and handed it to him. "You might want to read this," she said. Elias took it, feeling the weight of it lighter than the ledger had been, but not without meaning. He unfolded it slowly. The writing was careful, not the tight columns of numbers he had held before, but words, arranged with intention, signed at the bottom by several names he recognized, the sempstress, the cook, the teamster, even the stable boy, each name placed with the same steady pressure as if claiming something that had not been theirs to claim before. It spoke of shared water, of fair charges, of an agreement to keep accounts open for those who worked, not hidden behind doors. It was not a demand. It was not a rebellion. It was a statement. Quiet. Direct. Enough. Elias read it once, then again, then folded it back along its worn lines. "They stayed," he said. "They looked," Nita corrected gently. "Staying is easier when a man knows what he is standing in." He looked at her then, at the way she spoke without claiming ownership, without placing herself above what had happened, and he understood again why she had not stood in the center of the town when the ledger opened. Some truths needed distance to remain clear. "And Vale?" he asked. Nita's expression did not change. He still speaks well, she said. But now people listen differently. Elias let out a slow breath, not relief, not victory, just a release of something that had been held too long. That is enough, he said. Nita mounted her horse again, settling into the saddle with the same quiet ease she had carried from the beginning. It is always enough, she replied. If it holds. She turned the horse toward the open land, not back to the town, not toward any place Elias could name, and for a moment she paused, looking out at the horizon where the light was beginning to soften into evening. You do not belong to their story anymore, she said. Be careful not to build another one that does the same thing. Elias watched her, the words settling in him with the same weight as the ledger once had, lighter in form, heavier in meaning. I will remember, he said. She gave a slight nod, then rode off, her figure moving steady into the wide space beyond, becoming smaller not because she was leaving, but because the land was larger than any one person could fill. Elias stood there until she was no longer distinct from the distance, then turned back to the shack, to the wood stacked by the wall, to the work waiting without promise or applause. Inside, he placed the folded paper on the small crate he used as a table, not hidden, not displayed, just there, part of the space he now occupied. Outside, the wind moved through the grass again, carrying the same quiet it always had, and for the first time he understood that it had never needed to change for him to hear it differently. In Red Flint, the evening performance began as it always had, the lamps lit, the crowd gathered, the music rising to meet expectation, but something in the room had shifted in a way that could not be painted over. The actors still moved with practiced ease, the stories still unfolded with familiar rhythm. But the pauses between lines held longer, not on stage, but in the audience, where people now listened for what was not being said. The seamstress sat near the back, her hands folded in her lap, no longer sewing through the show. The cook stood by the side wall, arms crossed, watching not the performance, but the faces around her. The stable boy leaned against a post, his usual grin absent, his attention fixed on the words that once would have passed over him without notice. Even the man in the fine coat remained, not as a guest now, but as an observer, his gaze moving between stage and room, measuring the distance between them. Mr. Vale stood near the wings, his posture unchanged, his presence still composed, but the certainty that had once defined him now carried a thin line of effort, as if each gesture required a touch more care than before. When the performer in the spotless duster delivered the line about brave men taming empty land, a few people still clapped, out of habit more than conviction, but the sound did not fill the room the way it once had. It scattered, uneven, uncertain. And in that space, where applause used to rise without question, there was now something else, quiet and persistent, like a thought that had begun and could not be easily set aside. No one stood to challenge the stage. No one called out. The show continued. It always would. But beneath it, alongside it, something had taken root, something that did not belong to the performance and could not be controlled by it. Outside, the wind moved through the street, lifting dust into the lamplight, turning it gold for a moment before it settled again, and for those who had seen the ledger, who had heard the questions, who had felt the shift, the dust no longer looked like decoration. It looked like what it had always been, the ground itself, waiting to be seen without the need to make it beautiful. The seasons did not announce themselves out there, they shifted quietly, the air carrying a different weight in the morning, the wind changing its tone, the light settling in a new place across the ground, and Elias Boone learned to notice those things the way a man notices truth after he has once ignored it. Weeks passed without counting. The shack held together. The fence line he had mended stood straight enough to do its job. The work came and went in small, honest pieces, never enough to make him comfortable, never so little that he felt owned by the lack of it. He spoke less. He listened more. And in that listening, the world arranged itself without needing to be explained. One late afternoon, when the sky stretched wide and pale and the heat had begun to lift from the earth, a wagon approached along the far road, slower than most, its wheels turning with care rather than urgency. Elias watched from the shade of the shack, not expecting anything from it, not needing to. When it drew closer, he saw the driver, an older man with a hat worn thin at the brim, and beside him, a woman he recognized from the edge of Red Flint, the widow who had once watered beans with dishwater. They pulled to a stop near the fence, and for a moment none of them spoke, because some meetings do not begin with words. The man nodded once. "We heard you settled out here," he said. Elias stepped forward, resting one hand on the fence post, feeling the rough wood under his palm. "I did," he answered. The widow looked at him, her expression not grateful, not apologetic, just steady. "Things changed," she said. He did not ask how. He did not need to. The man shifted on the seat and reached behind him, pulling forward a small sack, then another, setting them down carefully on the edge of the wagon. "We had more than we needed this week," he said. "Felt right to bring it." Elias looked at the sacks, then back at them. "I did not do it for that," he said. The man gave a small shrug. "We did not bring it for that." The difference sat between them, simple and clear. Elias stepped forward and lifted one of the sacks, feeling its weight, grain by the sound of it, enough to last him days if he was careful. He set it down by the shack and turned back. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet, but not heavy. The widow nodded once, then looked out over the land, her gaze moving across the same stretch Elias had come to know without naming. "It looks different out here," she said. "It is the same," Elias replied. "It just does not pretend." She almost smiled at that, just a small shift at the corner of her mouth, then settled back into stillness. They did not stay long. They did not need to. When the wagon turned and rolled away, the dust it lifted hung in the air for a moment, then settled back into the ground, leaving no mark of where it had been. Elias watched until they were gone, then carried the sacks inside, placing them near the wall, not stacked, not hidden, just present, part of the space. Outside, the wind moved again, steady, unchanged, and he stood there for a while, not thinking of what had been, not anticipating what would come, just standing in what was. In Red Flint, the change had settled deeper by then, no longer new enough to be questioned, no longer fragile enough to be dismissed, but not yet strong enough to define the town entirely. It lived in the way people carried themselves, in the way conversations paused before agreeing, in the way accounts were now written where more than one pair of eyes could see them. Mr. Vale still ran the hall. The show still drew travelers. The music still played. But the shine had thinned, just enough that what lay beneath could not be entirely covered again. The seamstress had begun to keep her own record of hours, not hidden, not defiant, simply written and placed where it could be seen. The cook no longer accepted charges without asking what they included. The stable boy, no longer just a boy in the way he carried himself, counted feed and wrote it down, his marks uneven but deliberate. Even the man in the fine coat, who had long since returned east, had left behind more than questions. Letters arrived now and then, formal, measured, requesting updates, requesting clarity, requesting what had once been assumed. And through it all, Nita Greybird moved as she always had, not at the center, not at the edge, but along the lines where things met, where the town ended and the land began, where stories were either carried forward or left behind. One evening, as the sun lowered and the street filled with that familiar copper light, she paused near the boardwalk where it had all first shifted, her gaze moving across the faces, the doors. The small details that marked a place learning, slowly, to see itself. No one called her name. No one stopped her. And that was right. She did not belong to the part of the story that needed recognition. She belonged to the part that made recognition possible. After a moment, she turned and walked on, her steps quiet against the dust, leaving the town to its own pace, its own choices, its own slow movement toward something that might one day resemble fairness, or might not, but would never again be entirely blind to what it was built upon. He did not return to Red Flint, and that was not because he could not, but because he no longer needed to measure himself against it. The land gave him enough. The work gave him enough. And the quiet, the steady, unbroken quiet, gave him something he had not known he had been missing until it was no longer absent. Some nights, when the sky opened wide and the stars settled in clear and sharp, he would think of the hall, the music, the painted backdrops, not with anger, not even with regret, but with a kind of distance that allowed him to see it for what it had been, a story told loudly enough that people forgot to ask who it served. And then he would look at the line of the horizon, at the way the dark held without needing to be filled, and he would let the thought pass, the way wind passes through grass without staying. There was no final moment, no closing statement, no place where everything came together and declared itself resolved. There was only this, a man standing where the land met the sky, carrying nothing that was not his, owing nothing to a lie he had once helped hold up, and somewhere, far behind him, a town learning, slowly, imperfectly, to listen to a truth that had never needed a stage to exist.